Queen Jezebel. Jezebel is one of the oldest named evil queens in Western history, and her death, recorded in the 9th century BCE, is so viscerally specific that it has never been forgotten in nearly 3,000 years of storytelling. She was not a fairy tale villain. She was a real woman, a Phoenician princess from Sidon, who married King Ahab of Israel and brought her religion with her, promoting the worship of Baal in a kingdom where that was considered an act of spiritual war. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible, particularly Elijah and later Elisha, positioned her as the primary enemy of Yahwistic faith, and the books of Kings document her crimes in detail. The most damning of these was the judicial murder of a man named Naboth. Naboth owned a vineyard adjacent to the royal palace in Jezreel that Ahab wanted, and when Naboth refused to sell or trade it, Jezebel stepped in. She arranged for 2 false witnesses to accuse Naboth of cursing God and the king, which was a capital offense, and Naboth was stoned to death. Ahab got his vineyard, and Elijah, standing in that vineyard not long after, delivered a prophecy directly to Ahab that would define Jezebel's fate. The dogs would devour Jezebel in the plot of Jezreel, and no one would bury her. That prophecy, recorded in 1 Kings 21:23, is the sentence that hangs over everything that follows. After Ahab died in battle, Jezebel did not flee or collapse. She remained in the palace as queen mother, maintaining power through 2 successive sons, Ahaziah and then Joram. She was not a woman who crumbled, which makes what happens next all the more striking. Jehu, a military commander anointed by a messenger from the prophet Elisha, was tasked with wiping out the entire dynasty of Ahab. He drove his chariot furiously, which was apparently his reputation, killed Joram in the very field of Naboth, and then rode toward Jezreel. Jezebel knew he was coming, and instead of running, she painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked down from the upper window of the palace to watch him arrive. Scholars have debated this act for centuries. Some read it as defiance, a queen meeting death on her own terms, adorned and imperious. Others read it as a formal royal self-presentation, the only dignity available to her. Either way, she did not hide. Jehu looked up at her and called out to the eunuchs standing in the window with her, asking who was on his side. 3 of them looked down. He told them to throw her down, and they did. Her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and Jehu drove his chariot over her body. Then he went inside, ate and drank, and told his servants to bury her, because she was a king's daughter. But when the servants went out to bury her, they found almost nothing. The dogs had come quickly. What remained was her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. Elijah's prophecy, delivered years earlier in that stolen vineyard, had been fulfilled with an exactness that the text presents as divine precision. The image of those 3 fragments, a skull, 2 feet, 2 open palms, on the ground in Jezreel, is one of the most haunting in all of ancient literature, not because of its violence, but because of its specificity. It is worth noting that Jezebel is also referenced in Assyrian records, which confirm she was a historical figure, not a purely literary invention. The degree to which her portrayal in the books of Kings reflects objective history versus Yahweh's propaganda is a subject of serious, ongoing scholarly debate. But the death itself, the window, the eunuchs, the dogs, those 3 fragments left in the field, is the version the world has carried forward for 28 centuries. Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is not from a fairy tale. She is from the oldest and most uncompromising tradition of Western drama, the Greek tragic stage of the 5th century BCE, and her death is not a moral simplification, but a moral catastrophe that philosophers and playwrights have been arguing about ever since. She was the queen of Mycenae, wife of Agamemnon, and by every account a woman of formidable intelligence and absolute fury. Her husband had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia at the port of Aulis to obtain favorable winds for the Greek fleet sailing to Troy. He had killed their child for military logistics. Clytemnestra did not forgive him. While Agamemnon spent 10 years at Troy, she took a lover, Aegisthus, and waited. When Agamemnon returned, she welcomed him with ceremonial purple cloths laid across the ground, the kind of honor reserved for gods, and then she killed him in the bath, trapping him in a net or robe so he could not fight back, and stabbing him. She was not subtle about it afterward. In Aeschylus's Agamemnon, the first play of his Oresteia trilogy, written around 458 BCE, she stands over his body and describes the killing with something that sounds almost like satisfaction. She ruled Mycenae with Aegisthus for years after that. Her death comes in The Libation Bearers, the second play of the trilogy, when her son Orestes returns in disguise, commanded by the god Apollo through the oracle at Delphi to avenge his father. Orestes kills Aegisthus first. Then he confronts his mother, and this is where Aeschylus does something that no subsequent playwright has entirely surpassed. Clytemnestra, realizing what is about to happen, bares her breast to her son, the breast that nursed him, and asks him if he can really kill the woman who fed him. Orestes hesitates. His companion Pylades speaks, reminding him of Apollo's command. Orestes kills her. It is one of the most morally agonizing moments in all of ancient drama, not because Clytemnestra is innocent, but because the act of matricide is not clean. Orestes is immediately driven mad by the Furies, the Erinyes, ancient spirits of vengeance, specifically charged with punishing those who spill family blood, and they pursue him across the Greek world. The Oresteia resolves this in its third play, the Eumenides, by placing Orestes on trial at Athens before the goddess Athena and a jury of citizen judges, in what Aeschylus frames as the founding of civic justice and the end of the blood cycle. The vote ties. Athena breaks the tie in Orestes' favor. The Furies are transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly ones, and appeased. Clytemnestra's death is the hinge point of this entire architecture. She is killed because she killed. But killing her creates a new wound that requires the entire machinery of civilization to resolve. Euripides wrote competing versions in his Electra and his Orestes, giving Clytemnestra more sympathetic shading and Orestes more psychological damage. Homer mentions her fate in the Odyssey as a cautionary counterpoint to the faithful Penelope. Across all versions, the death is consistent: a son, a sword, a mother who did not flinch. What changes is what the storyteller thinks it means. The evil queen, Queen Grimhild. The evil queen from Snow White is so embedded in Western visual culture that most people forget she began as a biological mother, not a stepmother. In the Brothers Grimm's first published edition of Sneewittchen in 1812, before later editions softened the story by making her a stepmother instead, a change that carried forward into every major adaptation, including the Disney film. She is the evil queen against whom all others are measured, the template. The original modern version of the archetype, and her methods and her death, reflect a world in which villainy is punished with the same coin it spent. In the Grimm tale, she attempts to kill Snow White 3 times after the huntsman fails to bring back her lungs and liver as proof of the deed. First, she disguises herself as a peddler woman and laces Snow White's bodice so tight the girl cannot breathe and collapses. The dwarfs save her. Second, she returns with a poisoned comb that renders Snow White unconscious the moment it touches her hair. The dwarfs save her again. Third, she brings the poisoned apple, half white and half red, eating the white half herself to prove it is safe, and Snow White eats the red half and falls into the death-like sleep. And then the dwarfs cannot save her, not immediately. She lies in a glass coffin for what the text implies is a long time. The prince's arrival, and in the original Grimm version it is the jolting of the coffin being carried that dislodges the apple, not a kiss, wakes her. The evil queen comes to the wedding. And here the tale does what the Grimm tales do best. It makes the punishment a perfect mirror of the crime. She is forced to put on a pair of iron shoes that have been heated red hot in a fire, and she is made to dance in them until she dies. There is no negotiation. There is no speech. She dances until she falls. This is the death in the source material, brutal, symmetrical, and designed to satisfy a moral logic that has nothing to do with mercy. Disney's 1937 film, the first full-length animated feature in history, released on February 4th, 1937, and directed by David Hand, handled the death differently. The queen, voiced by Lucille Laverne, transforms herself into an old hag using a potion she brews in her dungeon laboratory, takes the poisoned apple across a stormy night, and eventually is chased by the 7 dwarfs up a cliff face during a thunderstorm. She attempts to pry loose a massive boulder to crush the dwarfs below her. Lightning strikes the ledge she is standing on. The rock crumbles. She falls. 2 vultures sitting on a dead branch above watch her go, and then they open their wings and drop after her. Disney does not show the impact. It does not need to. The vultures descending tell you everything. The character's name, Grimhilda, does not appear anywhere in the film itself, and comes only from supplemental Disney production materials. A detail worth knowing because the film's queen is deliberately unnamed, a cipher of pure vanity and spite. The White Witch, Jadis. Jadis the White Witch is the most cosmically ambitious of all the evil queens in this list because her villainy is not confined to one kingdom or one world. According to C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, published in 1955 as a prequel to The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe from 1950, Jadis comes from a world called Charn, a dying planet she ruled as empress. And when she was about to lose a war against her own sister for the throne, she spoke the deplorable word, a magic that killed every single living thing in her world except herself. Every person, every animal, every bird, every insect in Charn, dead in a moment because she refused to lose. She then slept in a frozen palace for untold ages until 2 English children accidentally woke her, brought her briefly into our world, and then inadvertently transported her into Narnia at the moment of its creation, where she did not belong and was not welcome. Lewis establishes her as genuinely ancient and genuinely monstrous, in a way that makes her jealousy and cruelty feel earned rather than cartoonish. In Narnia, she has reigned for 100 years, holding the land in perpetual winter with no Christmas, a detail that functions as both world-building and symbol, a world without warmth, generosity, or the turning of seasons, frozen in her image. She turns enemies to stone in her courtyard. She is tall, white-skinned, and cold in the way that certain kinds of power are cold, completely indifferent to what it costs others. Her death comes at the Battle of Baruna, fought after Aslan's resurrection from the stone table. The deep magic of Narnia had given the witch the legal right to kill every traitor, and Edmund Pevensey had technically been her traitor, and Aslan had resolved this by substituting himself, dying on the stone table in Edmund's place. But the deeper magic, which the witch did not know because it predated even her long memory, stated that a willing innocent killed in a traitor's place would break death itself. The stone table cracked. Aslan came back to life. He breathed life back into the stone statues in the witch's courtyard, raising an army, and then led that army to the battle where the witch was winning against the Pevensey children and the creatures of Narnia. Lewis, in the book, describes the witch's death with notable economy. Aslan is upon her, and then she is dead. He does not linger on the mechanics. The 2005 film, directed by Andrew Adamson with Tilda Swinton as Jadis, gives the battle far more space, staging it as an extended sequence in which the witch fights Peter Pevensey in single combat and nearly kills him before Aslan arrives. The death in the film is shown as a decisive kill, Aslan bringing her down with full force, the battle turning in an instant. The BBC 1988 television adaptation follows the book's restraint more closely. What all versions share is the essential logic. The queen who killed an entire world to preserve herself is ultimately destroyed, because she could not imagine a power older than her own knowledge. The Queen of Hearts. The Queen of Hearts is a special case in this lineup, because in Lewis Carroll's original Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865, she does not die. She does not even really lose in any meaningful sense. She is a figure of pure comic absurdity, a tyrant whose constant command of "off with their heads" is undermined throughout the book by the fact that, as Alice eventually observes, nobody actually gets executed. The executions are ordered constantly and carried out never. She is hysteria given a crown, power without consequence, a very specific kind of satirical target for Carroll, who was setting up a certain kind of Victorian authority that makes a tremendous amount of noise while accomplishing nothing. Alice defeats her not with a sword or magic, but by growing large enough, literally and metaphorically, to stand her ground and tell the court that they are nothing but a pack of cards. Then she wakes up. The Queen of Hearts never dies in Carroll's text. She is simply made irrelevant and then dissolved back into a dream. This is worth establishing because every adaptation that gives her a death is doing something Carroll deliberately avoided. In Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland from 2010, the villain is technically the Red Queen, played by Helena Bonham Carter, a conflation of Carroll's Queen of Hearts and the Red Queen from Through the Looking Glass, the 1871 sequel, which is a common pop culture error worth naming. Carroll wrote them as entirely separate characters, with entirely different thematic functions. Burton's Red Queen is defeated when Alice kills the Jabberwocky, her champion, which strips her of her authority. Her sentence is banishment rather than death. She is exiled with the treacherous Knave of Hearts, which in its own way is a darker punishment than a clean death. In ABC's Once Upon a Time, which ran from 2011 to 2018, the Queen of Hearts is revealed to be Cora, the mother of the evil Queen Regina, played by Barbara Hershey. Cora's death, which occurs in Season 2, is among the more emotionally devastating deaths in the series. Regina and Snow White arrange for Cora's own heart, which Cora had ripped from her own chest long ago to free herself from feeling, to be placed back inside her body. The restored heart floods Cora with love, specifically love for her daughter Regina, and the shock of it, the sudden rush of feeling into a heart that has been hardened by decades of darkness and ambition, kills her. She dies in Regina's arms saying she could have been enough. It is a death designed to hurt the hero more than the villain, and it does its job with precision. Maleficent. Maleficent's death in the 1959 Disney animated film Sleeping Beauty is one of the most visually spectacular villain deaths in the history of animation, and it is worth understanding what it was built on before describing it, because the original source material handles the villain's end quite differently. Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tale La Belle au Bois Dormant, which is the primary literary source for the Sleeping Beauty story, does not feature a dramatic dark fairy with a name or a dragon form. The villain is an old fairy who was not invited to a christening, curses the princess, and then simply dies of old age before the story's climax, which is almost comedically anticlimactic. The Brothers Grimm version, Dornröschen, similarly dispatches the wicked fairy without fanfare. Disney's Maleficent, who describes herself as the mistress of all evil and is voiced with magnificent theatrical menace in the 1959 film, was not invited to the christening of Princess Aurora. Her curse, that Aurora will prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel before the sun sets on her 16th birthday and die, is softened by the good fairy Merryweather into a deep sleep breakable by love's first kiss. Maleficent spends 16 years failing to find Aurora, before realizing the three good fairies have hidden her as a peasant girl in the forest. Once she executes the curse, she imprisons Prince Philip to prevent the one thing that can undo it. The three fairies rescue Philip, arm him with the sword of truth and the shield of virtue, and he fights through a forest of thorns. Maleficent conjures before reaching the castle. She transforms into a massive dragon, black and purple, breathing green flame, and the battle on the cliff face is animated with a scale and ferocity that was extraordinary for the period. The fairies enchant the sword. Philip throws it directly into the dragon's chest. Maleficent rears back, staggers, and collapses over the edge of the cliff. Where her body falls, only her black cloak remains on the rocks below, the sword of truth piercing it. It is a deliberately clean resolution, evil literally deflated and left as an empty garment. The 2014 live-action Maleficent, directed by Robert Stromberg and starring Angelina Jolie, substantially rewrites this, repositioning Maleficent as the film's true protagonist. The villain in that version is King Stefan, Aurora's father, who dies falling from a tower in a struggle with Maleficent after she recovers her wings. Maleficent survives both that film and its 2019 sequel, Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. The death of the original animated Maleficent remains the canonical version, and that empty cloak on the rocks below the cliff is one of Disney's most quietly perfect images. The Wicked Witch of the West. The Wicked Witch of the West is technically not a queen. She holds regional authority over the western quadrant of Oz and controls the winged monkeys through a golden cap rather than ruling through any formal monarchy. But she sits so firmly within the evil queen archetype in cultural imagination that excluding her from this list would be its own kind of distortion. L. Frank Baum published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900, and in that original novel the witch is described as having only one eye, which functions like a telescope, able to see across vast distances. She sends successive waves of creatures to stop Dorothy and her companions, wolves, crows, bees, the Winkies, the winged monkeys, and when Dorothy is finally brought to her castle, the witch covets the silver slippers. Not the ruby ones. The ruby slippers were a change made for the 1939 MGM film specifically to show off the capabilities of Technicolor, and in the original text they are silver. The witch tries to steal them by making Dorothy trip on an invisible bar, gets one slipper, and Dorothy's response is to grab the nearest bucket of water and throw it at her in fury. The witch melts. Baum writes it matter-of-factly. The witch cried out in despair, and then she melted away, as a lump of sugar does in water, and Dorothy swept up the resulting puddle and threw it out the door. Dorothy is surprised by how easy it was. That flatness, that anticlimactic simplicity, is part of what Baum was doing, puncturing the idea that great evil is necessarily powerful or durable. The 1939 MGM film, directed by Victor Fleming and starring Margaret Hamilton as the witch, transformed this into one of cinema's most iconic death sequences. The witch has Dorothy cornered in her castle. She sets the scarecrow's arm on fire. Dorothy, trying to douse the scarecrow, grabs a bucket of water and splashes it, and some of it catches the witch. The witch begins to melt, screaming, "I'm melting, melting, oh, what a world! What a world!" sinking into her own hat and cloak, as her guards watch in bewilderment. It is theatrical, specific, and perfectly performed. Gregory Maguire's 1995 novel Wicked and the 2003 Broadway musical adaptation by Stephen Schwartz and Winnie Holzman retold the story from the witch's point of view, naming her Elphaba and giving her a full and sympathetic life. In both the musical and in John M. Chu's 2024 film adaptation, the water scene is staged and then complicated, with strong implications that Elphaba did not actually die but staged her own death to escape, a deliberate and meaningful subversion of the original ending that asked the audience to question what they thought they knew. Evil Queen Regina Mills. Regina Mills, played by Lana Parrilla across all 7 seasons of ABC's Once Upon a Time from 2011 to 2018, is the most psychologically complex entry in this list, and she is here partly because she represents something genuinely unusual in the Evil Queen tradition. An evil queen who does not die and whose story argues, across 156 episodes, that the entire archetype is a wound rather than an identity. Regina is the evil queen from Snow White transplanted into the small town of Storybrooke, Maine by her own dark curse, which froze all the fairy tale characters in time without their memories for 28 years. She begins the series as the town's mayor, the most powerful person in Storybrooke, and the primary antagonist. Her backstory is dispensed carefully across the show's early seasons. She was a young woman whose first love, A stable hand named Daniel was killed when a young Snow White, trying to help, revealed to Regina's mother, Cora, the secret relationship, and Cora, who had ambitions for her daughter that did not include stable hands, tore out Daniel's heart and killed him. Cora had also ripped out her own heart long before that, choosing power over feeling. Regina grew up under a mother who controlled her absolutely, and her villainy in the fairy tale world was built on grief, twisted into fury across years of manipulation by Rumpelstiltskin. The show does not excuse her. She did terrible things, but it traces the mechanism of how she became who she became with more care than the fairy tale tradition usually allows. In Season 6, the series takes this further by having Regina magically split the evil queen part of herself from her body, creating a literal separate entity. The heroes vote to execute this split-off evil queen. Regina refuses to allow it. The evil queen is instead given a new life in an alternate realm, a second chance. By the series finale, Season 7, Episode 22, leaving Storybrooke, Regina has become the good queen of a united realm called the Enchanted Forest, governing all the fairy tale worlds in one. She is the only evil queen in this list who lives to rule well. The show uses her arc to make an explicit argument that what we call an evil queen is usually someone whose capacity for love was used against her until it curdled. That argument is not subtle, but it is sustained over 7 years with enough detail that it earns its conclusion. Cersei Lannister. Cersei Lannister is the most politically sophisticated evil queen in this list, and her death? In Season 8, Episode 5 of HBO's Game of Thrones, titled The Bells and directed by Miguel Sapochnik, was the most controversial moment in a deeply controversial final season. Lena Headey played her across 8 seasons, from 2011 to 2019, in an adaptation of George R.R. Martin's ongoing novel series, A Song of Ice and Fire, the most recent published volume of which, A Dance with Dragons from 2011, leaves Cersei alive as of its final pages, meaning the books have not yet provided a definitive ending for her. In the television version, Cersei's power was always precarious in a particular way she articulated herself. A woman in a world that gives women influence but not authority, operating entirely through the men around her, and increasingly without them as sons and allies, and leverage died away one by one. Her most spectacular act in the series is the wildfire explosion that destroys the Great Sept of Baelor in the Season 6 finale, killing the High Sparrow, Marguerite Tyrell, Mace Tyrell, Kevin Lannister, and hundreds of others in a single green fire catastrophe. She watches from a window with a glass of wine, having outmaneuvered everyone who thought they had outmaneuvered her. It is one of the show's finest sequences, and perhaps her finest hour, as dark as that phrasing is. Her death 2 seasons later carries none of that control. As Daenerys Targaryen burns King's Landing from Dragonback, despite the city's surrender, Cersei and her twin brother Jaime attempt to escape through the tunnels beneath the Red Keep. They are blocked by cascading rubble from the destruction above. They embrace. The ceiling comes down on them. They are found in the rubble in the following episode, dead beneath the ruins of their family's seat of power. The gap between the death she probably imagined for herself, some kind of final confrontation, a last political move, a last word, and the death she actually received, buried in silence under falling stone, is the core of why it provoked such strong reaction. Whether that gap is brilliant or a failure depends on what you think the show was doing with her. Queen Ravenna. Queen Ravenna, played by Charlize Theron in Universal Pictures' Snow White and the Huntsman from 2012, and its sequel-prequel, The Huntsman. Winter's War from 2016 is the most extensively backstoried evil queen in film history, given an origin so specific that her villainy becomes almost mechanistically inevitable. As a child, her mother cast a spell over her that bound her survival to her beauty, meaning that aging, or being surpassed in beauty by another, would literally kill her. She has spent her life consuming the youth of other women, draining it from them and absorbing it, leaving her kingdom as a gray wasteland of women aged prematurely and broken. Her specific fixation on Snow White is not mere vanity, but survival. Snow White's heart, according to the magical mirror, is the source of power that would make Ravenna truly immortal, rather than just preserved. She rules through fear, dark magic, and the loyalty of her brother Finn, who helps her extend her reach. In the 2012 film, Snow White escapes, survives in the Dark Forest, finds the dwarfs and then the Duke's son William, and eventually leads an assault on Ravenna's castle. The final confrontation happens inside the throne room. Ravenna moves to rip out Snow White's heart. Snow White, clad in armor, appears to yield, goes limp, and then when Ravenna leans close, drives a concealed blade into her. Ravenna's reaction is one of the film's most visually striking sequences. Her face begins to age rapidly, years collapsing across her features in seconds, her body disintegrating into black fragments that scatter and vanish. A villain unmade by the very beauty she could never stop pursuing. In The Huntsman. Winter's War, Ravenna is resurrected through a shard of her enchanted mirror and inhabits it, gradually reconstituting herself before being destroyed a second time when the mirror itself is destroyed. Charlize Theron's performance across both films makes Ravenna one of the few evil queens in modern cinema whose beauty and terror feel genuinely unified rather than just aesthetically coordinated. She is also one of the only villains in this list to die twice. Queen Narissa. Queen Narissa, played by Susan Sarandon in Disney's Enchanted from 2007, directed by Kevin Lima, is the most self-aware entry in the evil queen tradition, because the film she inhabits is specifically designed to play with the conventions of every Disney fairy tale that came before it. And Narissa's death is staged as a direct visual quotation of Maleficent's dragon death from Sleeping Beauty in 1959, a deliberate callback that the film trusts its audience to recognize and enjoy. Narissa rules the animated kingdom of Andalasia and is threatened by her stepson Edward's upcoming marriage to Giselle, a cheerful, singing, relentlessly optimistic fairy tale heroine, because a queen means a queen mother, and a queen mother is no longer the most powerful woman in the palace. She pushes Giselle into a magic well that deposits her in live-action New York City, which is about as far from Andalasia as it is possible to get. Narissa follows her eventually because her plans keep failing. The climax takes place atop a Manhattan skyscraper, most likely the Woolworth Building, based on production design, where Narissa transforms into a massive dragon in the real world, a spectacular genre violation, dark purple and scaled, enormous on top of a building made of steel and glass, and decades of perfectly ordinary human life below. She seizes Robert, the cynical divorce lawyer played by Patrick Dempsey, who has spent the film falling for Giselle, and dangles him from the top of the building. Giselle, who has spent enough time in New York to have acquired actual anger rather than just animated worry, climbs up after him. She grabs Robert. Narissa loses her grip and her footing simultaneously and falls from the top of the building, dropping into the city far below. The film does not show the impact. It does not need to. The fall's enough, and the genre inversion is complete. The princess saved the prince, the dragon fell, and the city went back to being the city. The sequel, Disenchanted, released on Disney Plus in 2022, does not bring Narissa back. It finds a different kind of evil queen to work with, and the less said about that, the better. Queen Ingrith. Queen Ingrith, played by Michelle Pfeiffer in Maleficent. Mistress of Evil from 2019, directed by Joachim Ronning, is the most institutionally evil queen in this list, and her death is the most undignified, which is partly the point. She is the Queen of Ulstead, a human kingdom bordering the moors, the fairy realm protected by Maleficent, and she presents herself throughout the film as a warm, elegant, reasonable woman interested in peace and a good marriage between her son Prince Philip and Aurora. This is entirely false. Ingrith has spent years engineering the conditions for a genocide of the fairy folk. She uses iron, which is lethal to fairies, as a weapon, and has developed a biological agent from a dark flower capable of killing fairies when dispersed in an enclosed space. Her plan involves luring the fairies to a wedding ceremony in the Ulstead Chapel and releasing the compound there, killing them all at once while maintaining plausible distance. Her scope of villainy, methodical, institutional, disguised behind ceremony and maternal warmth, puts her closer to the Cersei end of the spectrum than the Grimhild end. She shoots Maleficent with an iron bullet during the chaos she orchestrates, nearly killing her. Maleficent is saved and ultimately transformed into her phoenix form, her true nature as a dark fae, and returns to the battle. The fairies fight back. And Ingrith's death comes not from a sword or a fall or a bolt of magic, but from Flittle, one of Aurora's fairy godmothers, played by Imelda Staunton, who is dying from Ingrith's iron dust at the moment she uses her last available magic to transform Queen Ingrith into a goat. A small, confused, ordinary goat, standing in her own throne room, in her own palace, the queen who orchestrated a genocide, who played her role with elegance and precision and cold intelligence, ends the film as livestock, led away bleeding, stripped not just of power, but of the dramatic villain's death she had, in a different kind of story, earned. It is the most humiliating conclusion in this entire list, and it is clearly intentional. Some evil queens fall off cliffs. Some melt, some are buried under rubble, and one becomes a goat, and the movie absolutely means it. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.